Move on to our second presenter of the evening, who is Richard Allen Cohen. And Richard grew up in Portland, Maine. He attended Bowdoin College, where he co-majored in art and science. Having always maintained an avid interest in art, he's now transitioned from a 40-year career in cardiovascular research to being a full-time fine art photographer living in Northwest Connecticut. Richard has exhibited his photographs in numerous solo and group shows at venues including the 555 Gallery, Panopticon Gallery, the Griffin Museum of Photography, Photographic Gallery San Miguel Allende, Galatea Fine Art Gallery, Kingman Gallery, Sohn Fine Art, and 5 Points Gallery. So, Richard, we are delighted to have you with us tonight, and we would love to see your work.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm sure there's a lot of people who are listening who are fascinated with Caleb's presentation. But thanks for your introduction and inviting me to participate in this event. And I also want to thank the PRC for the opportunity to discuss my photographic work. And thank you all for coming. What I'd like to do with this time is to tell you a bit about myself and how I got into photography and how my scientific background influences my concepts, my subjects, and my process in photography. And I'll then show you a video that discusses more of those issues with respect to shooting 2 of my recent portfolios. And then I hope I can answer some questions for you. In addition, while I introduce myself, I'm going to play a slideshow of images from 2 bodies of work. The first body is part of my love affair with the Mexican agave plant that I've been able and privileged to photograph when my wife and I have gone to San Miguel Allende in the last 4 years. And then I'm going to show images from a more recent portfolio, Discovered Worlds. First, a bit about my background. My father was a plumber, so Cable and I share some background, and he built houses in his career as well. He taught me that attention to detail and getting it right in design are both important, and there's nothing worse than a plumber that gets it wrong. My mother was always an artist and taught art in high school. At 97, she's still doing watercolors, so I've always experienced art around me. I went to Bowdoin College and Hopkins Medical School, and after that, I did a 40-year career in medicine and research, but I kept art close to me and my family. During that career, I ran a large research lab at Boston University with as many as 25 to 30 people in it, studying cardiovascular disease, principally related to diabetes. Then about 7 years ago, I found myself getting in the way of the careers of younger people in the lab, and I wanted to push them to take over the research projects that they were working on. And at that time, my camera was about 6 years old, and I just wasn't getting out of it what I wanted to. So I did 2 things. First, I went and worked with Bill Morse out of his Boston South End studio for about 2.5 years, learning Photoshop and fine art printing. And secondly, I did a semester-long photography atelier at the Griffin Museum with Meg Birnbaum. And what that did was give me a taste of contemporary photography and let me see what it would be like to participate in it. It also introduced me to a lot of people who are now good friends of mine. And then over the next few years, I weaned myself away from full-time research and I went more to more work in photography. So, of course, you can't really take the scientist out of the photographer. So what I want to do is to discuss with you my thinking about parallels that exist for me in doing science and photography. What this all boils down to is that one of the greatest joys a scientist can have is after discovering a new insight to share it with others. And that's what drives me as a photographer. The most important motivations of my research career, exploration, discovery, imagination, and creativity, all apply to both concepts and process in my photography. In terms of the concepts that drive my work, curiosity about what's around me is number one, nature figuring most prominently. I'm fortunate to be able to take 2 to 3 mile walks with my wife on And these are really a way to stay healthy and sane, but they're also field trips to scout locations to return to. The themes of my work are nature, the natural world, processes of aging and decay, but also explorations of other worlds or altered perceptions of this world. Attention to details is essential to me. My photographs reflect a close-up inspection of natural and environmental subjects, whether realistic or abstract. As an example, most of the agave work that I'm showing you was shot with a very long lens so that I could avoid being stuck with those sharp spines at the tips of the agave fronds while I captured details of patterns and colors deep within the plant. In my practice, I recontextualize what's around me, and I think that's a very scientific, analytical process. I've been in love with the landscape since I was a child, and I have a habit of seeing it all around me in non-traditional contexts. They say that an infant cat will sense the horizon and land upright during a fall, so I think recognition of what constitutes a horizon and landscape is practically innate. It certainly is for me. My vision is prompted to seeing horizons and landscapes, whether it's on a boat hull or a tree trunk, an agave frond, or in a small stream. One of my favorite quotes of Minor White's is, "Photograph things not only for what they are, but also for what else they are." I'm constantly looking for new contexts within which I see landscapes. The environment figures importantly in my work on landscapes. We are all interested in seeing a better environmental future. My direction in science, as well as an interest in the environment, was set in a 9th grade biology class when we took a 1-week intensive course concerning the environment, as well as by a National Science Foundation grant in college to a team of 12 of my fellow students to study water pollution on the Androscoggin River. Much of my effort in bringing images of the environment to my work is to envision a future where the environment has been protected. In addition to concepts, my process in photography also reflects my training as a scientist. About choice of subjects, Gary Winogrand said, "I photograph to find out what something looks like when photographed." I can't think of a more scientific process. Of course, as photographers, we all struggle with the fact that the camera is an imperfect instrument to capture what our eyes and brain see as reality. Much of our job is to work with the data to output what our brains saw in hindsight, or what we want to see in hindsight. While imaging, I try to take full advantage of time, space, and perspective. My images are not spontaneous. Although I love his photographs of France, the decisive moment of Cartier-Bresson is the furthest thing from my mind when I'm shooting. I spend enormous time framing and collecting images so that I can bring them home and make something else out of them. In terms of post-production, a studio is a laboratory with its own equipment and its own processes. It's no coincidence that my workbenches, I don't know if you can see them in the background, are the height of lab benches. Everything from my approach in Photoshop to printing is highly managed. Take color, for instance. In post-production, I use lab color because it so easily separates the ability to adjust contrast and luminance on one hand and contrast and color on the other hand. It's also because lab color best mimics the way human vision is separated into luminance and color at the level of neural pathways from rods and cones in the retina to the cerebral cortex. My artistic aesthetic is the same as my scientific aesthetic. What I mean by that is that elements of my photography in terms of choice of subject, composition, light, color, even the non-spontaneity of the work are scientific in nature. That's me in the image, love it or leave it. And frankly, it was the most difficult thing to me to accept about my photography. I just wasn't going to be a street photographer or a portraitist. Being based in science does not mean that insight and serendipity are not important. They're important in both fields. And now when I make a decision that an image or a portfolio is ready for prime time, I mean the same thing that I did in the past when there was a concept or an idea, an experiment that worked out, that filled out a research project, or I wrote a research grant. And I found it then ready to show to the outside world for the judgment of others. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do in my photography. Hello, I'm Richard Allen Cohen. I used to live and work in the city. Now I live a few miles from here, and this is where I work, along the paths and streams in the beautiful forests of Northwest Connecticut. I'm a conceptual photographer who creates grand imaginary landscapes out of small-scale natural elements like mossy rocks, streams, waterfalls, and decayed tree stumps. To show you what I mean by that, in this 12-minute video, I'd like to tell you about why I create these landscapes, as well as to go deeper into how waterfall images in two of my recent portfolios were made. I've been interested in landscapes since I was a small child and drew and painted them as a teenager. When I started in photography seriously about 10 years ago, I was drawn to both outdoor landscapes as well as to constructing interior landscapes composed from images made through store windows. I now create landscapes that consist of imagined mountains, forests, fields, and horizons. As is evident from this composite on my home page, I make both abstract and realistic landscape images. I've found abstract landscape forms in many places that include the weathered sides of boat hulls in my Waterline series, one of which is shown here, and the beautiful forms and colors found on Mexican agave plants, one of which is shown here. I'm also interested in using realistic elements of the landscape in imaginary or constructed images, such as this image, which was composited from multiple photographs of a mossy tree stump. In this video, I'd first like to explain my purpose in imagining and creating images of waterfall landscapes in which the viewer's perspective is altered so that the landscapes appear much grander than they actually are. Secondly, I hope to enable viewers to understand the appearance of the images, which of course is paramount, but also to provide insights into the artistic thinking and concepts behind the images. Thirdly, I will explain the technical aspects of creating these images to share those methods with other photographers, several of whom have asked me about the techniques involved. But before I get to the technical aspects, I'd like to show you some of the images in my Climate Falls and Planet Falls portfolios. As you look through them, I hope they'll raise the question of why I have made these images in this way. First, I believe that viewing landscape art should invite the viewer to see new and unfamiliar places, as well as to remind them of landscapes that they've seen before. Secondly, compared with my abstract landscape images, these realistic landscapes provide the viewer with more starting information about the landscape being presented, but they too call on the viewer to imagine aspects about this landscape. Where are we? What's the reason for the strange skies and stars? What's going on with the scale of the landscape? Are these little streams or huge waterfalls? My purpose in making these particular images appear realistic is to offer the possibility to the viewer that they are real places. This is because I wish to convey the beauty of nature in an idealized form. In many ways, this is my personal response to the challenges of climate change that are affecting the environment and therefore the landscape. I hope that imagining an idealized landscape will stimulate myself and others to protect the environment. I'm creating the appearance of a new reality, if you will, to imagine a future when the landscape is preserved. In these images, I do this in two ways. First, all of these images are clearly not the reality we see when we hike outdoors. They have starry skies taken from the Hubble Space Telescope, as well as smoke, clouds, and mist that I have photographed and put into the images to provide an imaginary atmosphere surrounding the landscape. These make it obvious that they are not photographs of real places. Secondly,
Unlike most photographs, I have created the images in a way that they appear hyperrealistic, both in perspective and in detail. I have acquired the images by panning across a relatively small-scale intimate landscape in a way that provides the image with a unique perspective, making the landscape appear much grander than its real scale would otherwise appear. In addition, I have used a technique called focus stacking in order to create an image that is in focus in the foreground, mid-range, and background, which makes these imagined landscapes more realistic, inviting the viewer to enter. This last image is the one that I've chosen to demonstrate how these images are produced. There are 3 stages in image development that I will talk about here. First, I will tell you about aspects of image acquisition in the field, using focus stacking to make frames that are later stitched into the completed panorama. Second, I'll briefly show you the steps I used during post-processing in Photoshop, used to merge the photo stacks and to stitch the panorama. And third, I will show you compositing techniques to improve upon the waterfall texture, to give it a sense of movement, and to create and merge the background textures and skies. Finally, I also should mention what I'm not going to include in this video, and that is anything about improvements in light, contrast, color, and sharpening, all routine Photoshop techniques that I have used to create the final image. To give you a better idea, this is the Photoshop file of the image we're going to look at. After the entire image is processed, the Photoshop file had, in this case, in excess of 20 layers that are shown at the right. I'll be showing you only what goes into making the 2 layers in the Photoshop file shown highlighted in light gray in the layer stack on the right. I'll begin by showing you how I approach making the image in the field. To get the perspective that I'm looking for in these images requires getting down low in the water, wearing boots and waders. I'll often begin with my phone, trying out different angles and heights, obtaining images like this one. Then I'll set up my camera and tripod, and using Live Viewer on the camera's LCD, pan across the image, assuring that I am framing the panorama properly. When I acquired the image that I'm going to discuss further, I took a single horizontal frame, more or less conventionally, at small aperture, blurring the waterfall because of the prolonged time of exposure. To acquire the final image, I've turned my camera on its side. I've then taken multiple images, focusing on prominent features in the frame, in the background, in the midground, and in the foreground, that will later be merged into one focus stack. Then I pan across the field in overlapping frames, and in each one repeat the process of focusing on features throughout that frame. In this way, I'll acquire 30 to 50 images in the whole panorama of 4 to 5 individual frames. Then, in post-production in Photoshop, I'll open each photo stack, in this case 8 images, and using auto-alignment and auto-blending tools, I merge the images into one frame shown here. You can see that all areas of the merged stack are in focus, unlike the remaining image in the background. I do the same with the other stacks, creating overlapping focus frames like this. Then, these 4 merge frames are stitched in Photoshop, shown here. Finally, this stitched image was cropped along the dotted line into the final panorama. As I mentioned before, I often increase the texture of the waterfall in order to enhance the appearance of flowing water and give the impression of a grand waterfall. In order to do this, in the field I take another panorama of the flowing water at a much shorter exposure, usually between 1/50th and 1/20th of a second, shown here. This image was also created from 4 vertical frames that were focus stacked on the water itself. Then in Photoshop, using a mask, I blend the desired amount of texture of the water into the image of the blurred water and get a final result shown here. In a final step, I add to the image the textures and colors in the environment and background. In these series, I have often used high-resolution Hubble Space Telescope images or photographs of skies, smoke, and mist, altering their color and contrast freely to suit the waterfall image. This is one such Hubble image shown at reduced opacity overlying the waterfall image. I then create a mask shown here and paint in the areas that I desire to appear in the image while masking out those that I don't. The white portions of the mask then apply only those areas of the Hubble image to the composited final image shown here. Lastly, I believe that a photographic print is an important tool to work through the final stages of post-processing of an image, but also to present the final image in a format suitable for hanging on the wall. I've printed the images in Climate Falls and Planet Falls on Canson high-gloss photo paper. They are then encased between a Sintra backing and a veneer of clear plexiglass called an acrylic float mount. The process of making the images that I've shown you allows for a high-resolution print. This is an example of a 24 by 48-inch image in the Planet Falls series mounted in this way. The acrylic mount preserves a clear view into the landscape, just as through a window would. An additional border frame can be added for hanging if you desire, but I hope you'll agree that the acrylic mount looks fantastic just as it is.
Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that it has given you a greater appreciation of the how and why of the images that I make. If you have any questions about what I've shown you, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. If you have an interest in looking at or purchasing prints, I'm happy to discuss the details and send you price lists. You can reach me via the contact information on my website, richardallencohen.com. Thank you again. Sorry for that final crass commercialism. This is what happens when somebody suggests to do a quarantine project.
Richard, thank you so much for your presentation. It was so good to see so many of your images and from the different series. If anyone has any questions, please put them into the chat. I keep thinking about the work that you showed at the beginning of your presentation of the agave plants. And when I first was looking at those, I really did not understand what I was looking at. I definitely thought not necessarily that they were landscape, but to me they really looked like like geodes, fossils of some kind. And so my question to you about those images is, what do you keep in mind when you're photographing them and photographing the details so closely? Are you looking for those landscapes? Are you looking for specific abstractions, or are you, what are you looking at in the plant?
So thank you for that. That's a great question. And there's an answer for it. And it'll be somewhat embarrassing to me. I make up a story, a creative story when I go out looking at these things. First of all, going out into the landscape in Mexico, looking at these plants, which are awesome, is a wonderful exploration, right? But the first series I showed you was called Agave Night Visions. And what I started to see in those plants was the idea that just maybe the plants during a starry night could imprint a landscape that they were seeing around them. Okay, it's a very similar story that I made up when I looked at boat hulls, and you know, imagine that the surrounding landscape of a boat hull was somehow imprinted on the boat hull, and it was for me to discover that evidence. So, you know, when I started doing that, making up a story, you know, I was just as flabbergasted as you are listening to my explanation. But once I did that, it served as a stimulus for me to go back and keep looking at that way. And I found it a very useful method of stimulating my imagination. So when I saw something, it would fit into one or another story. Just between you and me, Jessica.
I won't tell anyone. Oh, that's just that's fantastic to hear that that's what was going through your head. I love that. Well, really, I cannot thank you enough for sharing this with us. And I have to say, it's been also so great to see these short videos that you and Caleb have produced. That's very inspiring, I think, you know, and like I don't know, did you say you made that video during COVID, during the past year?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was, you know, it was a project. Somebody had been telling me, actually, Emily Bell, she might be in the audience, that suggested I do that. And, you know, it sat for, I don't know, a year and a half. And there came the time where I had the time, and it was fun doing it. You know, I learned all the movie things, and it was fun.
Well, I think you're setting a great example for the rest of us. So that's great. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you again.